Good day everyone, I am Ruth Sanchez of CSU. For our lecture in Abnormal Psychology class, we will discuss the topic Assessing and Diagnosing Abnormality, specifically Assessment and Diagnosis, Assessment Tools, Challenges in Assessment, and Diagnosis. The recording of this lecture is for academic purposes only and shall not be used for profit or commercial purposes. All information is attributed to Abnormal Psychology book author Nolen Huexema. This is our class main reading material for Abnormal Psychology. Okay. Assessment is a process of gathering information about people's symptoms and the possible causes of these symptoms. The information gathered in an assessment is used to determine the appropriate diagnosis for a person's problems. A diagnosis is a label for a set of symptoms that often occur together. All assessment tools must be valid, reliable, and standardized. Validity is the accuracy of a test in assessing what it is supposed to measure. The validity of a test can be estimated in a number of other ways. A test is said to have face validity when on face value the items seem to measure the test it is intended to measure. Content validity is the extent to which a test assesses all the important aspects of the phenomenon that it purports to measure. Concurrent validity is the extent to which a test yields the same results as other established measures of the same behavior, thoughts, and feelings. A test has predictive validity if it is good at predicting how a person will think, act, or feel in the future. Construct validity is the extent to which a test measures what it is supposed to measure and not something else altogether. The reliability of a test indicates its consistency in measuring what is supposed to measure. There are types of reliability. Test-retest reliability describes how consistent the results of a test are over time. Researchers often will develop two or more forms of a test. When people's answers to different forms of a test are similar, the tests are said to have alternate form reliability. Researchers often split a test into two or more parts to determine whether people's answers to one part of a test are similar to the other answers to another test. When there is similarity in people's answers among different parts of the same test, the test is said to have high internal reliability. Different raters or judges who administer and score the interview or test should come to similar conclusion when they are evaluating the same people. Then it is said to have a high inter-rater or inter-judge reliability. One important way to improve both validity and reliability is to standardize the administration and interpretation of tests. A standard method of administering a test prevents extraneous factors from affecting a person's response. Similarly, a standard way of interpreting results makes the interpretation of the test more valid and reliable. For assessment tools, we have clinical interview, specifically mental status exam, which assesses the person's general functioning. Here, the clinician probes for 5 types of information. First, the clinician assesses the individual's appearance and behavior. Second, in a mental status exam, a clinician will take note of the individual's thought processes, including how coherently and quickly he or she speaks. Third, the clinician will be concerned with the individual's mood and affect. Fourth, the clinician will observe the individual's intellectual functioning, that is, how well the person speaks and any indications of memory or attention difficulties. Fifth, the clinician will note whether the individual seems appropriately oriented to place, time, and person. In a structured interview, the clinician asks the respondent a series of questions about symptoms he or she is experiencing or has experienced in the past. The format of the questions and the entire interview is standardized. At the end of the interview, the clinician should be able to determine whether the respondent's symptoms qualify for a diagnosis of any psychological problems. Another one is symptom questionnaires. These questionnaires can cover a wide variety of symptoms representing several different disorders. There is also personality inventories. Personality inventories usually are questionnaires meant to assess people's typical ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. The most widely used personality inventory in professional clinical assessment is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. There is also behavior observation and self-monitoring. Clinicians often will use behavior observation of individuals to assess deficits in their skills or other ways of handling situations. The clinician looks for specific behaviors and what precedes and follows these behaviors. One of its advantages is that the clinician sees firsthand how the individual handle important situations. One disadvantage is that individuals may alter their behavior when they are being watched. Another disadvantage is that different observers may draw different conclusions about individual skills. In addition, any individual rater may miss the details of an interpersonal interaction. Finally, direct observation may not be possible in some situations. If direct observation or role-playing is not possible, clinicians may require self-monitoring by individuals, that is, keeping track of the number of times per day they engage in a specific behavior and the conditions under which this behavior occurs. Intelligence tests. These are used to get a sense of an individual's intellectual strength and weaknesses, particularly when mental retardation or brain damage is suspected. Some examples of intelligence tests include the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test, and the Wechsler Intelligence Test or Scale for Children. These tests were designed to measure basic intellectual abilities, such as the ability for abstract reasoning, verbal fluency, and spatial memory. Now we'll look at the neuropsychological tests. If the clinician suspects neurological impairment in a person, paper and pencil neuropsychological tests may be useful in detecting specific cognitive deficits such as memory problem. One frequent used neuropsychological test is the Bender-Gestalt test. This test assesses individual sensory motor skills by having them reproduce a set of 9 drawings. Two of the most popular batteries are the Holstead-Rayton test and the Luria-Nebraska test. These batteries contain several tests that provide a specific information about an individual's functioning in several skill areas such as concentration, dexterity, and speed of comprehension. Brain imaging is used to determine if a patient has a brain injury or tumor. Researchers use brain imaging to search for differences in brain activity or structure between people with a psychological disorder and people with no disorder. Example, we have the computerized tomography or the CT. A CT scan can reveal brain injury tumors and structural abnormalities. The two major limitations of a CT technology are that it exposes patients to X-rays, which can be harmful, and that it provides an image of brain structure rather than the activity. The positron emission tomography, or PET, can provide a picture of activity of the brain. PET scans can be used to show differences in the activity level of specific areas of the brain between people with a psychological disorder and people without a disorder. Another procedure to assess brain activity is the single photon emission computed tomography, or the SPECT. The procedure is similar to PET, except there is a different tracer substance injected. It is less accurate than PET but also less expensive. The magnetic resonance imaging, or the MRI, provided much more finely detailed picture of the anatomy of the brain than do other technologies, and it can image the brain at any angle. Structure MRI provides static images of brain structure. Functional MRI provides images of the brain activity. Researchers are using MRI to study structural and functional brain abnormalities in almost every psychological disorder. The psychophysiological tests are alternative methods of the CT, the PET, the SPECT, and the MRI used to detect changes in the brain and nervous system that reflect emotional and psychological changes. An electroencephalogram measures electrical activity along the scalp produced by the firing of specific neurons in the brain. The EEG patterns recorded over brief periods are referred to as evoked potentials or event-related potentials. Clinicians can compare an individual's response to the standard responses of healthy individuals. Heart rate and respiration are highly responsive to stress and can be easily monitored. Sweat gland activity, known as the electrodermal response, can be assessed with a device that detects electrical conductivity between 2 points of the skin. Now, projective test is based on the assumption that people, when they are presented with an ambiguous stimulus such as an oddly shaped ink blot or a captionless picture, they will interpret the stimulus in line with their current symptoms or current feelings or relationships with others and conflict or desires. The Rorschach ink blot test is a test consists of 10 cards, each containing a symmetrical ink blot in black, gray, and white or in color. The examiner tells the respondent something like, "People may see many different things in these ink blot pictures. Now tell me what you see, what it makes you think of, and what it means to you." The thematic apperception test, or TAT, consists of a series of pictures. The individual is asked to make a story about what is happening in the picture. Okay. One of the greatest challenges to obtaining valid information from an individual can be his or her resistance to providing information. Evaluating children is also a challenge in assessment. Children, particularly preschool-age children, cannot describe their feelings or associated events as easily as adults can. So parents are often the first source of information about a child's functioning. Teachers also provide information about children's functioning. A number of challenges to assessment arise when there are significant cultural differences between the assessor and the person being assessed. The first problem may run into is what the person may not is that if the person may not speak your language or may speak it only partially. Symptoms can be both underdiagnosed and overdiagnosed when the individual and the assessor do not share a language. One solution is to find an interpreter to translate between the clinician and the person. Now let us look at diagnosis. Recall that a diagnosis is a label we attach to a set of symptoms that tend to occur together. This set of a symptom is called syndrome. Syndromes are not lists of symptoms that all people have all the time if they have any of the symptoms at all. Rather, they are lists of symptoms that tend to occur within individuals. A set of syndromes and the rules for determining whether an individual's symptoms are part of one of these syndromes constituted a classification system. One of the first classification systems for psychological symptoms was proposed by Hippocrates. Hippocrates divided all mental disorders into mania, which are the states of abnormal excitement, melancholia, states of abnormal depression, paranoia, and epilepsy. Emil Kraepelin published the first modern classification system, which is the basis of our current systems. The classification system, most widely used in the United States, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. The classification system used in Europe and much of the rest of the world, the International Classification of Disease, or ICD, has many similarities to the most recent edition of the DSM. The first edition of the DSM, published in 1952, outlined the diagnostic criteria for all the mental disorders recognized by the psychiatry community at the time. These criteria were somewhat vague descriptions, heavily influenced by the psychoanalytic theory. The second edition of the DSM, published in 1968, included some disorders that had been newly recognized since the publication of the first edition, but otherwise was not much different. Because of the descriptions of disorders in the first and the second edition of the DSM were so abstract and theoretically based, the reliability of the diagnosis was low. In response to the reliability problems of the first and the second editions of the DSM, in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of the DSM known as the DSM-3. This third edition was followed in 1987 by a revised third edition known as the DSM-3R, and in 1994 by a fourth edition known as the DSM-4, revised as DSM-4-TR in 2000. This new edition removed some diagnoses that were in the DSM-4-TR, added some new diagnoses, and modified the criteria for others. Lastly, the social psychological dangers of diagnosis. We noted earlier that once a diagnosis is given, people tend to see it as real rather than as a judgment. This can make people oblivious to the biases that may influence diagnosis. One influential critic of psychiatry, Thomas Sayce, argued that so many biases are inherent in determining who is labeled as having a mental disorder that the entire system of the diagnosis is corrupt and should be abandoned. He suggested that mental disorders do not really exist and that people who seem to be suffering from mental disorders are oppressed by a society that does not accept their alternative ways of behaving and looking at the world. The primary role of the diagnostic system is to organize the confusing array of psychological symptoms in an agreed-on manner. Standardization can lead to faster advances in our understanding of the causes and the effective treatment for disorders. That's all for our lecture. Thank you and good day.